Who really controls the world? Depending on your perspective, the answer might be mega banks like JP Morgan, asset managers like BlackRock, tech companies like Microsoft, or unaccountable and unelected international organizations like the World Economic Forum. Maybe it's all of the above. But what if I told you that there's an entity that's bigger than all these institutions? After all, these institutions seem to be on the same page when it comes to things like CBDCs, digital IDs, and smart cities. Well, that is not a coincidence. So today we're going to tell you about this entity and reveal who's really in control. Or not, but the that seems to be coordinating all the world's most powerful institutions is none other than the United Nations, or UN. This is something we've noticed while researching these institutions, and we figured it was about time we found out whether this really is the case. Spoiler alert, it definitely seems to be. To understand why, we must go back in time to before the UN was founded. Once upon a time, the world wasn't as peaceful as it is today. There were constant wars and conflicts that caused disruption. After the Napoleonic Wars of the 1800s, the powers that be decided to try and achieve a period of peace. Of course, back then, those powers were mostly in Europe, and they tried to achieve peace by creating the Concert of Europe in 1815. No, it wasn't a classical music piece. It was actually the very first international organization in history tasked with ensuring that its member countries didn't go to war. If you know your history, you'll know the Concert of Europe inevitably started to fracture, and it fell apart completely when the First World War started in 1914. But a precedent had been set. After the war ended in 1918, the powers that be decided to try for a period of peace again with the League of Nations in 1920. The difference this time was that the League of Nations had other goals besides preventing war. Goals related to human rights, such as labor conditions. Alas, the League of Nations didn't last as long as its predecessor. It fell apart when the Second World War began in 1939, less than 20 years later. But as the saying goes, the third time's a charm. By the time World War II ended in 1945, the UN had effectively been founded, though it was officially founded a month after the war ended. Like its predecessors, the UN was founded by the powers that be, 50 countries back then. It includes essentially every country on the planet, all 193 of them. Like the League of Nations, the UN's primary purpose was to uphold peace, but its founding charter included a laundry list of other goals to keep its member countries preoccupied. These not only included humanitarian efforts but also the fostering of international cooperation on other issues that are global in nature. So then, what's the problem? Well, if you claim to have global issues, then you can justify global solutions, and the only way you can have solutions is to have a single global government, which is basically what the UN is. This means that you need a single global military, and so on. As it so happens, the UN established its own military in 1948, shortly after its founding. The UN went on its first so-called peacekeeping mission in 1956. After the Cold War ended in 1988, the UN's military purpose expanded from keeping 10 countries under control to keeping people under control. The UN recently published a blog post explaining that its peacekeeping operations will soon expand to social media with the creation of a so-called digital army which will fight misinformation and disinformation. By now, you'll know that this is code for stuff that the people in power do not like. The blog post itself specifies that the UN's digital army will also combat any information that impedes the progress towards the Sustainable Development Goals, or SDGs. The SDGs consist of 17 goals that all member countries must meet by 2030. This is why you've seen that 2030 date everywhere. It's also why every country seems to be rushing to roll out digital IDs, central bank digital currencies or CBDCs, and smart cities. The SDGs, the implementation of all these dystopian technologies by 2030. The clock is running out, and the UN and its affiliates are trying to rush them to the finish line. If you want to make sure other people see this video before that happens, smash that like button to give it a boost in the algorithm, and take a second to share this video with anyone who you think is willing to watch it. Note that everything I'm saying here can be fact-checked. I'll leave a few links in the description. Now this begs the obvious question of who controls the UN. To this question, we must understand how the UN works.
Because the UN is colloquially referred to as an international body.
Its various branches are often referred to as organs. A plus marketing from whoever came up with that one. Jokes aside, the UN consists of 6 organs: the General Assembly, the Security Council, which you'll have heard of, the Economic and Social Council, the Secretariat, the International Court of Justice, and the Trusteeship Council. Now these last 2 aren't that important for the purposes of this video.
The only thing worth noting about the International Court of Justice is that it's the only UN organ that's not based in New York City.
As for the Trusteeship Council, it was created to allow countries to become sovereign. It was shut down in 1994.
Nothing to see there, I'm sure.
The General Assembly consists of the UN's 193 member countries. Representatives from these member countries meet every September to discuss and vote on resolutions. Important resolutions require 2/3 of votes in order to pass, whereas unimportant resolutions require a simple majority, more than 50%. Now the Security Council consists of 15 countries, 5 of which hold a permanent place on the Council and 10 of which rotate every 2 years. Those 5 countries are the winners of the Second World War: France, Russia, China, United States, and the United Kingdom. Interesting history there, but no time to tell it. On that note, here's where things get really interesting. The 5 permanent members of the Security Council have the power to veto important UN resolutions. Now this has been extremely controversial, primarily because it means that these 5 countries can reject any UN resolutions that affect them negatively. Although Russia's use of veto power has been the most publicized, it was the US that refused to join the UN unless it was given veto power. It's believed that the veto will never be removed from the Security Council for this reason. It would mean that the US and its allies would have to give up this power as well. You should also know that the US tried to pass a resolution to invade Iraq after the 9/11 attacks.
The resolution was rejected by the UN, but the US invaded Iraq anyway. Shout out to Mr. Amazing Video about the UN for that fun fact. Nobody's hands are clean in the bloody battle for global control.
Ever guess who is in the car?
GM Crypto.
Now we have so much fun and exciting stuff coming up for you on today's show. But first we need to talk about the Coin Bureau Deals page guy. That's right, Jessica, because it really is the place to find the very best deals in crypto. For starters, you can find bonuses of up to $40,000 at some of the best crypto exchanges. And that's not all, Jessica, because you can also get discounts on hardware wallets, sign-up bonuses for some of the top exchanges, and trading fee discounts of 8 to 60%.
Guy. Where can people find this deals page? Well, just head on over to coinbureau.com/deals or use the link in the description.
In any case, the Secretariat is the administrative body of the UN, the actual global government. It is heavily involved in the process of creating, passing, and implementing UN resolutions. The Secretariat's leader is nominated by the Security Council and elected by the General Assembly every 5 years.
Here's where things get even more interesting.
The leader of the Secretariat, also known as the Secretary General, doesn't have a term limit, but none of them have served more than 2 terms, at least not yet. Regardless, the history of Secretariat elections reveals whose hands are on the wheel. From what we could gather, the UN underwent something of a shakeup in the early 1990s. Recall that passing resolutions requires either a 2/3 vote or a majority vote. In case it wasn't clear, every member country has an equal vote in this process regardless of how much they contribute to the UN. Now this is more significant than you think, because it means that the country which influences the most other countries can achieve de facto control of the UN. In the 1990s, it looked like the balance of power was shifting to the developing world in this regard.
And its allies didn't like that one bit.
In the early 1990s, the Secretary General of the UN was Boutros Ghali of Egypt. The US opposed him to the point that they offered to create a non-profit foundation for him if he stepped down. He refused, and his second term, which 2 out of 3 member countries voted for, was vetoed by the US. Secretary General since then has been closely aligned with the interests of the United States.
Kofi Annan of Ghana was next in line.
He created the Development Goals or MDGs, which came before the SDGs, and even wrote the original letter which created the ESG investment ideology back in 2004. Now, if you've watched any of our videos about ESG, you'll know that its criteria are based on the UN's SDGs. You'll also know that Secretary General Antonio Guterres of Portugal is the biggest fanboy of the SDGs and has been a key player in the push for things like digital IDs, CBDCs, and smart cities. If you've watched any of our videos about these dystopian technologies, you'll know that they're being pushed by unaccountable and unelected international organizations that represent the interests of the private sector and the public sector. The biggest corporations and the biggest governments. On the private sector side, you have entities like the World Economic Forum or WEF, which partnered with the UN to accelerate the implementation of its SDGs through ESG back in 2019. On the public sector side, meanwhile, you have entities like the International Monetary Fund or IMF and the World Bank, which are part of the UN. With entities like the WEF, you have megabanks like Bank of America and asset managers like BlackRock controlling the flow of capital to ensure that ESG-compliant individuals and institutions get the money they need to meet the SDGs. And you tech companies like Microsoft creating the tech that they need for that. Entities like the WEF also try to influence the public sector with initiatives such as the Young Global Leaders, which involves hand-picking future potential leaders of countries, presidents, prime ministers, etc., and Global Shapers, which involves hand-picking potential leaders at the local level such as mayors. Entities like the IMF and the World Bank, you have various programs that involve giving loans to developing countries on favorable terms if they comply with the SDGs and with U.S. interests. International regulators like the Financial Action Task Force or FATF have also played a key role here. Similar WEF entities like the IMF also try to influence the private sector with restrictive regulations which result in centralized systems in developed countries and corrupt leaders in developing countries. This helps developed countries control their POP and control developing countries too. The result of this dynamic is that almost no developing countries have managed to become developed over the last half-century. According to macro analyst Lynn Alden, only 2 countries have transitioned. South Korea and Taiwan, both of whom are aligned with U.S. interests and are critical for its Asian influence. Speaking of which, the most viewed video on the UN's YouTube channel is a song about the SDGs by South Korean K-pop band BTS. Cringe. Anyways, it's safe to say that this state of affairs hasn't been ideal for most of the UN's member states since the 90s. Since that time, many leaders have spoken out at the UN's General Assembly. The most famous of these is probably former Libyan Prime Minister Muammar Gaddafi in 2008. Gaddafi ranted for over 90 minutes and even ripped a page from the copy of the UN Charter. For reference, addresses at the UN's annual SM are limited to around 15 minutes. Gaddafi was assassinated by US interests back in 2011, and there's been chaos in Libya and North Africa ever since. As Hillary Clinton infamously said, quote, "We came, we saw, he died." Give that speech of Gaddafi's a watch if you have the time. Even unhinged rants make sense sometimes. Anyhow, given Gaddafi's fate, it should come as no surprise that UN countries haven't been too keen about rocking the boat, i.e. upsetting the US. It hasn't stopped other leaders from speaking out, but it has definitely made them more discreet. Xi Jinping and Vladimir Putin spring most readily to mind here. Both have been noticeably absent from the UN's annual assemblies in recent years, opting to send their top diplomats instead. The last time they spoke physically at the UN's General Assembly was way back in 2015. What's odd is that their addresses seem to have been deleted by the UN's YouTube channel. These speeches can be found elsewhere on YouTube. Note that I say thankfully because they add another perspective that you need to see if you want to truly understand not just who's in control but who wants to be in control. Without getting all sides of the story, it's impossible to know this info. Xi's 2015 address was an interesting mix of appealing to the US-affiliated audience and offering them an alternative to the US-led international order. Xi specified that a multipolar world is coming. That China is on the side of the developing countries and that it invites them to follow China on its path to prosperity. Xi also reminded everyone present that China was the first country to sign the UN Charter back in 1945. Something that can actually be seen on the History Channel's YouTube page. This was presumably meant to highlight the fact that China has the power to create and influence UN-type organizations. As you might
Putin's address was similar to Xi. The only difference was that it was a lot more direct. Putin said that after the Cold War, the US believed it had the right to control the world. Putin warned that the world is changing in this regard and that the UN must recognize this. Putin also pointed out that sanctions are increasingly being used as a weapon to eliminate economic competitors. It goes without that Russia is a bit of an exception in this case, but it is true. IMF has threatened to cut countries out of the global financial system if they don't comply with the US. It's safe to assume that the statements made by Xi and Putin are why their speeches were deleted from the UN's YouTube channel. I'll remind you that China and Russia are 2 of the 5 members of the Security Council. 2 of the 5 countries that have the most influence within the UN. What's notable about the UN meeting back in 2015 is that it marked the beginning of the SDGs. As I mentioned earlier, the SDGs were originally called the MDGs in the early 2000s. The MDGs required member countries to meet similar goals by 2015. When they couldn't, the UN rebranded and tried again. From our perspective and from the perspective of many in the UN, the MDG failed because there wasn't enough funding. The fact that the 2008 financial crisis happened in the middle of the rollout definitely didn't help either. Fast forward 15 years and the SDGs seem to be in a similar position. As you can imagine, the UN's inability to follow through on its plans and the infighting among the Security Council has called the very existence of the whole organization into question. In a 2020 interview, UN Secretary-General Antonio Guterres addressed these concerns head-on and revealed some very interesting things. Antonio confirmed everything I just told you. The UN was focused on the Cold War after the Second World War ended. After the Cold War ended, there was a period of US supremacy within the UN. Over the last few years, however, there have been tensions between the US, China, and Russia. Second, Antonio explained that these tensions have made it very difficult for the UN to coordinate its global policies such as those in the SDGs. When asked whether he was worried about China and Russia joining forces to challenge the US, Antonio smirked and said that this may not last for long. Let's just say that he was dead wrong on that one. Anywho, the third thing Antonio revealed was that the UN is terrified of the prospect of the US leaving the organization or even just pulling funding. Some of you might recall that former US President Donald Trump had pulled out of one of the UN's sub-entities. Finally, Antonio underscored the fact that the UN is hyper-focused on everything digital. He said there was a lawlessness emerging in cyberspace that the UN needs to fight. By now, you'll know that this has nothing to do with human rights. The UN is absolutely terrified of losing control of the narrative. From the perspective of the interviewer, however, the UN is absolutely terrified of being labeled as ineffective, and they even asked Antonio point blank if that's why the UN is starting to focus on other things rather than say actual peace between its member countries. Antonio vehemently denied this. Even so, it's clear that the UN is not only losing control of the narrative but also losing control of its most powerful member countries. In fact, this could be why the UN turned to private sector entities like the WEF for help. It could no longer be sure that it could secure funding and support from the public sector. The consequence of this was it made things like digital IDs, CBDCs, and smart cities more visible to the average person. The UN reaching out to the private sector for support has also probably further alienated public sector entities, including the powerful governments the UN is trying to coordinate. So given these facts, you might be wondering why the countries that aren't happy with the UN just leave. Well, believe it or not, but this technically isn't as explained by the government of Taiwan, which is not recognized as a country by the UN. Quote, the United Nations Charter deliberately made no provision for the withdrawal of member governments, largely to prevent the threat of withdrawal from being used as a form of political blackmail or to evade obligations under the Charter. They explained that this is because Japan withdrew from the League of Nations in 1933. Germany and Italy so followed suit, and the result was the Second World War. In other words, countries can't leave the UN because member countries are scared it will result in another world war. Consider that the UN probably prevented the Cold War from turning into a hot war. Whether any country has tried to leave the UN, the answer is yes, but here's what happened according to the Taiwanese.
Quote, the only other example of an effort to withdraw by Indonesia in 1965 tends to show that withdrawal, at least in the short term, has no force or effect. Now what's fascinating though is that the countries that seem the most eager to leave actually don't want to, namely Russia and China. 2015 addresses Putin and Xi both made it clear that they don't want the UN to end. This is somewhat surprising given their work on the BRICS, a potential competitor to the UN. If you watched our video about the BRICS, you'll know that the only thing that seems to be stopping it from becoming a bona fide entity is the absence of a commodity market boo. After researching the UN, however, it seems more likely that the BRICS countries would rather try and take control of the United Nations first. Perspective, all that's required for this to happen is for certain UN member countries, namely the US and its allies, to adhere to the Charter. From Putin's perspective, undermining the UN could undermine international cooperation, and that could set the stage for more conflict, just like the Taiwanese said. Indeed, history suggests that the creation of a new organization would happen after another world war, which nobody wants. It looks like China and Russia will continue trying to influence member countries to vote in their favor on resolutions until they wrest control of the UN out of the US's hands, and it looks like this seems to be working. If you want evidence of that, look no further than the map of countries that sanctioned Russia after its invasion of Ukraine last. Besides North America, Europe, and Oceania, the rest of the world is blank. Same page as the US and its allies. If you need more evidence, look no further than one of the resolutions that was passed at the UN meeting last month. It established cooperation between the UN and China's Shanghai Cooperation Organization. 80 countries voted in favor. 47 abstained. Only 2 voted against, the US and Israel. Continues, then when Antonio Guterres' current term ends in 2027, someone who's more affiliated with the Global South could take control of the de facto global government unless the US vetoes again. If that happens, then all the dystopian ideas contained in the SDGs could disappear overnight. 2030 could come around and we could still be owning things and being happy. Much to the chagrin of the left, but it's equally possible that the next Secretary General could be even worse. Countries like China and Russia aren't exactly known for their commitment to freedom and peace. A UN controlled by them and their affiliates could turn out to be 1,000 times worse than what we have now. And having no UN at all could result in an outcome that's 1,000,000 times worse than that. That's all for today's video. If you learned something new, let us know by smashing that like button. If you want to make sure you keep learning, subscribe to the channel and ping that notification bell. And if you want to help others learn, be sure to share this video with those who are willing to learn. If you happen to be into crypto, the Coin Bureau Deals page is where you need to go. It's got up to $40,000 in bonuses on the best crypto exchanges and the biggest discounts on the most secure hardware wallets. The link to that page will be down in the description. Thank you all for watching, and I'll see you next time.